I'd like to welcome everyone who's here. I know that we spend a lot of time on Zoom already, and so spending more time on Zoom isn't always the most enticing proposition. But I think we're going to get a lot out of what we're going to hear today. Just one quick note, this meeting is being recorded. We are recording this event. A lot of people have expressed interest in being here, but weren't able to come for scheduling reasons. And so with our speaker's permission, we're recording it, and then it will be posted so that others can see it as well. We are excited that you're able to join us today for the inaugural lecture hosted by the Forum on Constitutionalism and Democracy. As part of a public liberal arts college, Geneseo has a rare awareness of and commitment to its civic responsibility of providing liberal education for the public good. And this forum was established last year to support and further this commitment to the liberal arts by sponsoring programming and fostering campus conversations about civic education and liberal democracy and just about everything that comes in between. This event and the forum are supported by a grant from the Jack Miller Center, and we'd like to thank them for helping us make this and other events this year possible. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to mention just a couple of other events that we have planned for this fall and to invite you all to attend them. We have some really exciting stuff going on. On October 23rd, also at 4 p.m., we'll be hosting a discussion between Laura Field, who's a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, and Russell Muirhead, who's chair of the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. And they're going to be speaking on conspiracy and democracy, misinformation, anti-liberalism, and our constitutional future. So that should be really, really exciting and very timely. And then on November 19th, we'll be hosting Jeff Tulis of the University of Texas at Austin. He's one of our nation's leading experts on the American presidency, and he's going to be discussing the current state of our political institutions. So again, another really timely and really exciting event. We'll also be hosting several events in the spring, including some student discussion groups and other types of events. So please stay tuned for announcements about those as the academic year continues. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Nicholas Buccola is the Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science at Linfield College, where he teaches political theory and public law, and is the founding director of the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice. He's the author of 4 books, including The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass, The Essential Douglass, and Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy, as well as numerous articles which have appeared in scholarly journals as well as popular media. His most recent book, and the subject of his talk today, is The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr., and the Debate Over Race in America. And it was published by Princeton University Press. Now, this book has received all kinds of accolades. In addition to being named to Phi Beta Kappa's 2020 Book Awards shortlist, it's been reviewed very positively in the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and perhaps most impressively by Whoopi Goldberg herself on The View. And I'm also told that it's just about to be released in paperback as well. So do get yourself a copy. It's really a wonderful work. As a note of housekeeping, please be sure that your mics are on mute. They should be already. We will have time for questions and discussion with Dr. Buccola after his remarks. And for those, what I'll ask everyone to do, since we have such a large turnout here, which is wonderful, is just put your name in the chat, and I will monitor the chat and call on folks to unmute themselves as we go through the conversation. And if you're not able to unmute yourself, you can always put your question your full question in the chat and I can read it, and Professor Buccola will respond. So please join me in welcoming Nicholas Buccola. I'll turn it over to Nick. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Carly. I really appreciate it. I'm so grateful to Carly and Aaron for inviting me. Hearing that list of folks that are coming to speak after me, I feel unworthy. So hopefully I'll do my best to get this this semester off to a good start for the center. I'm grateful to all the folks who behind the scenes who make events like this possible, and as Carly said, to the Miller Center for promoting opportunities for us to come together and have these sorts of conversations. I think it's extraordinarily important, and so I'm really grateful to be able to join you. I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to share mostly images of the two gentlemen I'm going to be talking about today. So we'll just go back to the beginning here. So I want to take you back to February 18th, 1965, and to this space in particular. What you're looking at on your screen is the Cambridge Union in Cambridge, England, on the campus of the University of Cambridge. This is obviously an old and prestigious university, and this debating chamber is a site, had been the site of 150 years of debate. The union had just marked its 150-year anniversary. And this is one of the most prestigious and oldest debating societies in the world. And this space on February 18, 1965 was full. It was full beyond capacity. So every spot on those benches that you can see was filled with mostly students. The spots in the galleries upstairs were full. Indeed, it was so full in that chamber that when the debaters would enter the hall, they would have to step over the legs of students who were sitting on the floor. And that night, February 18, 1965, all those students were packed in. You had over 700 in this space that you can see. You had 500 more who were spread out in other rooms on the union premises watching the proceedings on closed circuit television. You had even more students lined up outside of the union building. They were all there. They were drawn there primarily by the opportunity to see James Baldwin, who was, in the words of his friend Malcolm X, the poet of the Civil Rights Revolution. Baldwin was the leading literary figure associated with this movement that was reshaping not only the United States, but in some sense having an impact internationally. Baldwin was there as a kind of he didn't like the term spokesperson, but he was there as a kind of embodiment of the movement in some ways, as somebody who was, whose face was second only to Martin Luther King as a face associated with that civil rights revolution. So the students were drawn by the opportunity to see this international literary celebrity right before their eyes, the poet prophet of the civil rights revolution. But they were also intrigued by the prospect of seeing Baldwin share the platform, as it were, with William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley had not yet gone on to achieve international fame. He would eventually do that, but he was second only to Barry Goldwater as the face associated with the conservative movement. Buckley was a founding father of the American conservative movement. He was somebody who, through his magazine, National Review, which I'll talk about in a little bit, his thrice weekly newspaper column, his public speaking tour, which would be upwards of 70 appearances a year, his appearances on television, radio, and so on. Buckley was one of the leading conservative polemicists in the country. And so the audience was intrigued by this opportunity to see Baldwin square off against this conservative. And it's important to point out, they also knew enough about Buckley to know that he was one of the leading skeptics of the civil rights revolution, that Baldwin was in some ways a symbol. And so they knew there was going to be a kind of intellectual prize fight that night. And what I like to point out is I describe, sort of set that scene of the climactic moment in this story, is that it's important to know that same night, February 18th, 1965, across the ocean in Marion, Alabama, just outside of Selma, we are in the midst of the Selma campaign and the Civil Rights Revolution. So if you've seen Ava DuVernay's fabulous film Selma, the scene of February 18, 1965 is actually captured very powerfully, where you see a small group of protesters gather in Marion at their church. They march to the jail where one of their leaders is being held to protest. They're confronted by Alabama law enforcement officers. They kneel and pray. The plan was to kneel and pray when they were confronted by the law enforcement officers and then return to their church. They kneel and pray, and the law enforcement officers assault them That night, you have this brutal attack, not only on the protesters, but also on the news media. The sheriff and others had deputized local ruffians to attack the press, so they were unable to take pictures of what was happening. And that night, J. Lee Jackson, 26-year-old church deacon, is murdered at the hands of Alabama law enforcement officers. So that happens the same night that Baldwin and Buckley are engaged in this debate. And that juxtaposition of those two things captures what the book is about. So the book is a pretty big book. It's not just about this night at Cambridge. It's a book that's about this night as a kind of climactic chapter, but it's really about these two individuals, these two leading public intellectuals, and sort of telling the story of their intellectual lives leading up to this night at Cambridge. So the book is thick. It's sort of like a doorstop. The paperback's a little bit smaller, but you can see it's a pretty thick book. So you sort of start out the book, walking into the chamber, as I just did with you, and then 250 pages go by before you're back in this chamber again. So what I wanted to do is tell the story of Baldwin and Buckley, who are almost exact contemporaries, and sort of weave the story of their lives, especially their intellectual lives, against the backdrop of the rise of the civil rights and conservative movements, two movements that they did so much to shape. And so tonight, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of that story in short form, and then we'll have an opportunity to chat, and we'll be happy to take questions and comments from folks. So let's start with young James Baldwin. So Baldwin was born August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem. He's the oldest of 9 children. And Baldwin, one of the things about Baldwin that's so powerful is he really is devoted to the idea that drawing on your autobiographical experiences can be a very valuable thing in artistic terms, but also in moral and political terms. So Baldwin describes his life in Harlem. He describes it in many of his nonfiction essays. He also describes it in his first novel, Go Tell on the Mountain, this autobiographical novel. And so Baldwin says, growing up, for a family like mine, growing up in Harlem in the 20s and 30s, the idea that dominates Baldwin's reflections on that experience is the idea of domination. He says that there's so many ways in which my family and folks like my family were subjected to domination, sometimes at the hands of particular people. So he talks, and you'll see in the clip I played from the Cambridge debate, he talks about the police officers, the landladies, the landlords, the insurance agents, the shopkeepers, and so on, who through millions of details of every day communicated to him that his life did not quite matter. And so Baldwin describes that extraordinarily powerfully in his writings. And he also describes his father is kind of a central figure in his reflections on Harlem. And he says, I watched my father come to believe what the white world said about him. He said, I watched my father consumed by self-hatred and despair. And so David Baldwin, James Baldwin's father, is somebody who, as far as his son is concerned, literally sort of dies of despair. He has a death of despair. And I'll talk a little bit more about his death in a little bit. But Baldwin sort of watches this scene. He watches his father consumed by despair. And he watches just those around him, those he's growing up with. Their freedom and their opportunities for fulfillment are limited at every turn. And so Baldwin, really, that's the foundation of everything for Baldwin. The other thing that's important to point out, though, is that Baldwin, in those autobiographical reflections, he wants to describe in as vivid detail as he can this experience of domination, but he also is careful to point out the stories of resistance, the stories of resilience. And so Baldwin says that in the face of such domination, one needs to find a handle or a lever, some way of fighting back. And for James Baldwin, that handle, that lever was language. Baldwin was obsessed with words. He was somebody who, read everything he could get his hands on. He describes very powerfully reading all the books that were available to him in the library in Harlem, and then venturing out beyond the boundaries of Harlem to libraries where he wasn't supposed to be. And he was often reminded that where he wasn't supposed to be, just so that he could read more things. And at a very young age, he begins writing and trying to get on paper kind of his sense of his own experience. And so that is really, really crucial to keep in mind. Language is something that's central to this story. And the other really important thing to say about Baldwin and sort of the way, sort of modes of resistance that were available to him, is that Baldwin did follow his father in one particular way, and that is into Harlem's storefront churches. David Baldwin was a lay Pentecostal preacher, and young James Baldwin, from the age of 14 to 17, was a young minister. And although he left the pulpit at age 17, he remained forever a preacher. And I argue in the book that he delivers a sermon that night at Cambridge. And so there's something about Baldwin as preacher that I want you to keep in mind as we go forward. Meanwhile, William F. Buckley Jr. is born in the same city, born in New York City. But as I say in the book, he may as well have been born on a different planet. William F. Buckley is born to an immensely wealthy family. So his father is a Texan who made and lost and regained fortunes in the real estate and oil businesses, both in the US and abroad. And his mother, Aloise Steiner Buckley, is a proud daughter of the Confederacy from New Orleans, who comes from a family sort of steeped in old money. And so whereas James Baldwin says one of the sort of dominant features of his childhood in Harlem is a sense of claustrophobia. He says, think about what it would be like to wake up in a room with no windows, sharing a bed with several of your siblings. That's one of the things James Baldwin tells us about his childhood. William F. Buckley, when he writes about his childhood, he sort of describes seemingly limitless space. He spends most of his childhood at his family's 47-acre estate in Sharon, Connecticut, known as Great Elm. And he has this idyllic childhood by just about any definition. They have a sort of homeschooling system. Buckley is one of 10 children, and they have this extensive homeschooling system for their kids. They have a couple of live-in tutors who live there with the family and direct this system, but they also hire visiting tutors to come in and teach these children everything under the sun. I mean, right there in the Buckley, at the Buckley estate, there was this robust liberal arts education. Most importantly, for the purposes of my book and for this talk, the Buckley children were taught a particular worldview. That worldview was marked by two major pillars. One is that they were Catholic. They were devoutly Catholic, and a particularly conservative brand of Catholicism. And they were also taught to believe in a political and moral doctrine that the family called individualism. And individualism was a word that Buckley would use throughout his political career. And it was really in those days a kind of catch-all term that was meant to capture the family's hostility to any form of collectivism. Socialism, communism, the New Deal policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Buckley children were also taught to be skeptical of, even hostile of, democracy. The Buckleys were taught that some people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. And good news, Buckley children, you are fit to rule. And so they were trained as these future leaders. And so that's really important for this story. And it's also important to note that the Buckley family, that philosophy of hierarchy I just described, was thoroughly racialized in the Buckley household. So, and this is something that William F. Buckley and his generation admit about their parents. They say our parents were racist by any definition. They taught us to believe in a kind of natural racial hierarchy. But, and this was a very important caveat for the Buckley children, our parents were not animated by animus. They weren't people who were racist as a result of racial animus. William F. Buckley Jr. says his mother especially taught this generation to believe that although they're racially superior, they have an obligation to take care of those beneath them, especially those who are loyal. So you can kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. That idea, although it undergoes some adaptation over the course of Buckley's life, that idea is central to his racial politics that are so at play in his conversation with James Baldwin. So Buckley goes on from these early days, this sort of idyllic upbringing, to eventually goes to Millbrook Prep School and then serves for 2 years in the Army, and then enrolls at Yale as a 21-year-old freshman. And Buckley says that he hoped and expected to some extent that at Yale he would have the experience of having those Christian and individualist beliefs reinforced and supported by his professors and his classmates. And he said he was disappointed to find that all too often his professors were indifferent or even downright hostile to some of the things that he was taught to believe in when he was growing up. So Buckley will go on to say that, that not only Yale, but many institutions of higher ed are marked by this paradox that Christian individualist parents send their children off to university only to have them converted into atheistic socialists. And so Buckley wants to fight back against that in any way that he can. He does that as a formal debater. He's a member of the Yale Political Union, and he has all sorts of political views he expresses there. He also becomes chairman, what they call chairman or editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News. So this image you see here is Buckley in his role as chairman of the student newspaper. And in that role, Buckley is, proves to be this kind of this rebel on campus. I mean, everyone knows who he is. He's very vociferous in his conservative views. He uses the student newspaper to comment on international politics, domestic politics. The election of 1948 happened when he was there, which was a very interesting election. So that occupied a lot of his attention, but also campus politics. He used his editorial role in order to, don't get any ideas here, students, but he used this editorial role to write these stinging editorials about his professors and all the horrific things they were saying in their classrooms. I guess nowadays we're saying them in the Zoom rooms. So he wrote these editorials in which he would call out professors for sort of saying mocking things about religion or capitalism. And after Buckley graduates from Yale, one of the first things he does is he sits down to write a book-length indictment of his alma mater. Now, again, students, don't get any ideas. So he writes this book, God and Man at Yale, and it's this book-length critique of what he calls the kind of hoax of academic freedom, right? So he has this kind of idea that academic freedom is a meaningful concept in the realm of research, but when it comes to teaching, Buckley argues that that alumni and boards of trustees and administrations at universities should play a much more active role in who gets hired to teach and in the subjects and what they teach within their subjects of expertise. So Buckley says that at Yale and at other institutions, there's absolutely no problem from his perspective of enforcing a kind of orthodoxy in what is taught and what is criticized. And so that idea is crucial for Buckley. This idea, one of his professors at Yale, one of the few conservative professors he found there, Wilmore Kendall, a very important political theorist, Kendall taught him this idea of the public orthodoxy. And the basic idea here is that Kendall says that any sane society is a closed society. And the idea of an open society is a very dangerous idea. Every society needs to have a core set of beliefs that everyone agrees to, and there has to be certain things that are beyond the scope of what's acceptable. And so Buckley takes that idea very seriously. It was very much consistent with everything he was taught by his parents. And if that book, God and Man at Yale, wasn't controversial enough, and it does prove to be a great controversy, people, it's mostly reviled in the reviews that come out, but he proves to be impossible to ignore. If that wasn't controversial enough, his next book is a book-length defense of Senator Joseph McCarthy. It's called McCarthy and His Enemies. It's co-authored with his Yale debate partner, L. Brent Bozell. And that book is, they acknowledge that McCarthy and his, leading of the latest Red Scare is not a perfect instrument, that he makes mistakes, he sometimes exaggerates and so on and so forth, but that McCarthy is playing an essential role. He is enforcing a public orthodoxy that needs to be enforced. And so Buckley and Bozell make this spirited defense of McCarthy, and Buckley was willing to go on the road and go on television, to defend McCarthy, whenever he got the chance to do so, and to debate various people over McCarthyism. So Buckley is this rebel. He's sort of arriving in the late 40s, early 50s on the intellectual scene as somebody who's going to prove to be impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, James Baldwin is arriving right around the same time. So in the late 1940s, 1948, to be exact, Baldwin leaves the United States. So essentially, Baldwin watches his father consumed by despair. His father dies in a mental institution in 1943. And one of his best friends, 3 years later, one of Baldwin's best friends, Eugene Wirth, who's this young idealist, he watches one of his best friends commit suicide. And Baldwin sees in both his father and his friend Eugene paths that might end up consuming him. He feels that he too will be consumed by despair unless he leaves. And what he really wants to do is to write a novel that will capture his experiences, the experiences of his own experiences, but also the experiences of folks like him in Harlem. And he just is unable to really do that in the United States. So he feels like the only chance he has to survive and to write this book that he feels that he needs to write is to leave. And so he follows many other great African-American artists to Paris. And he ends up leaving in 1948 to live in Paris. And in those years, in the late 40s and early 50s, as Baldwin is working on this novel, he's trying to figure out as he would say later, what it means to be an honest man and a good writer and how those two things are connected. And he's doing that in every genre imaginable. Initially, he does it through literary criticism. So he writes about other writers and tries to sort of get a sense of what he thinks is working and not working artistically and morally and politically as he's writing about other writers. And he's writing short stories, and he's working on this novel, and he's writing essays, trying to capture what his experiences were like in those years, in those earlier years, reflecting back. And really all of this writing that Baldwin is doing in this period, both the fiction and the nonfiction, I argue in the book that really he's obsessed with a kind of three central ideas. And the idea that's really more important than any other idea for James Baldwin going all the way through is what he called the question of identity. Who do we take ourselves to be as individuals, and who do we take ourselves to be as members of groups? A related question for him was, how does this conception of who we take ourselves to be, how does that lead us to treat other people? This kind of question of morality, right? And he wanted to think about the relationship between those two things, who we take ourselves to be and how we treat others. And then a third question that's kind of, bound up with those other two is a question of power, right? Who has power in the world and who doesn't? And how do we sort of manifest our power in the world, and what are the kind of power relationships, and if they're unjustified, how can we alter them? Those are the questions that obsessed James Baldwin. So he publishes that first novel, Go Tell on the Mountain, in 1953. It's widely it's reviewed quite well. He attempted to do in that novel, describe a family much like his own, and what he wanted to do is avoid what he called the pitfalls of protest fiction. And for Baldwin, this category of protest fiction was fiction that had a kind of political purpose that ended up overshadowing the humanity of its characters. And Baldwin thought it was really important, part of what it meant to him to be an honest man and a good writer, was to try to tell the truth, right? Tell the truth morally and politically, but in the process, tell the truth about human beings as you understand them in the world and as you hope they might become, right? So he's kind of operating in this literary this literary kind of theory we identify with Baldwin is realism, and it's a particular kind of realism. I think it's extraordinarily important to understand that that's what Baldwin was about, and you'll see in a minute how that plays out in his reaction to the Civil Rights Revolution. So Baldwin's writing, he writes Go Tell on the Mountain. He writes his second novel is Giovanni's Room, which is published in 1956, extraordinarily controversial novel. It's a novel about a love affair between a white American, David, who's traveling in Paris, and in Paris, he falls in love with an Italian bartender named Giovanni. And so a lot of people who worked with him on Go Tell on the Mountain refused to work with him on Giovanni's Room. And one of the reactions that he describes is that my publisher for Mountain said to me, "Why is a promising young Negro writer like you, Jimmy, why are you handing me an all-white gay novel?" And Baldwin said, in some strong language, something like, "You're missing the point. If you think that my first novel was about race fundamentally, and you think the second novel is about sexuality fundamentally, you're missing the point. Both of these novels are about the freedom and fulfillment of human beings, and what are the obstacles to freedom and fulfillment of human beings." And so that's really central to what Baldwin is up to in this period. So that is a kind of setup for these guys really, kind of arriving in the mid-50s in various ways. So the really important part of the story I want to highlight here is Buckley's founding of National Review magazine. So Buckley, after he writes these two books, and they prove to be successful books, they prove to get a lot of attention, but Buckley is very frustrated with the kind of glacial pace of book publishing, right? And all of the writers in the room can relate. It takes a long time to write a book. And even once you're done writing it, it takes a long time for the thing to appear in the world. And so Buckley wants to have an impact on day-to-day politics. He wants to try to engage more directly and more quickly. And so he tries to work for a conservative magazine. That lasts only a few months. Buckley was not cut out to be anyone's employee. Remember, some people are fit to rule. Other people are fit to be ruled. William F. Buckley Jr. was fit to rule. And so what he really wants is a magazine of his own. He recognizes that in the early 20th century, magazines on the left played an extraordinarily important role in the shaping of American political culture, in the making of American progressivism, magazines like the New Republic and the Nation. And so Buckley wants to do the same on the right. He wants to use a magazine to help make a movement. And most of us, if we want a magazine, we can't have a magazine. But William F. Buckley had those very wealthy parents, and they were willing to give him a nice advance on his inheritance. And he proved to be a very gifted fundraiser. And so in the years 1954, 1955, he's fundraising, and he's pulling together this magazine that ends up being National Review, that launches. Its first issue is in November of 1955. Now, Buckley's idea is to use this magazine again to create a movement. And what he wants to do is there's nothing that we could really call a conservative movement at the time, in part because a lot of folks on the right didn't agree on things. There were traditionalists who were especially worried about the perceived decline of morality and religion in the West. There were libertarians who were especially concerned about what they saw as excessive government involvement in the economy. And they didn't really like each other very much. And Buckley said, look, you may not like, Russell Kirk, Frank Meyer, you may not like each other, but there's a lot of things you don't like that you have in common, right? So you don't like communism, you don't like socialism, you don't like liberalism. How about we can agree on a certain set of things that we want to resist and fight, stand athwart history, as Buckley famously said, and that will be the kind of basis, that'll be the glue that holds us together, in addition to the really important glue of anti-communism. And so Buckley is forming this magazine, and it's really important that Buckley, I argue in the book, and I'm not the first to argue this, that Buckley really does play this outsized role in the shaping of American conservatism, because this magazine is what he wanted to do is serve as a kind of editor of conservatism, figure out who's allowed in, who's kept out. And so he plays this role as editor of conservatism, as a kind of gatekeeper, who's going to be allowed to stay at the Conservative Party and who's going to be bounced out. And so one of the big questions on everyone's mind is, what would this magazine that Buckley hopes will be a tribune of intelligent, responsible conservatism, what will this magazine have to say about race and civil rights? Now, I always like to point out that it's not a foregone conclusion that someone founding a conservative magazine in 1955, that magazine will take the position that Buckley takes. There were a lot of folks who thought of themselves as conservative, who also thought of themselves as friendly to civil rights. So the example that I think is most powerful is Senator William Nolan from California, who Buckley had write the lead article for the launching issue of National Review in November 1955. Nolan was a conservative. Buckley actually wanted Nolan to primary President Dwight David Eisenhower in 1956 to run to Eisenhower's right. Nolan also thought of himself as sympathetic to civil rights. So that's just one example among many. The most important partisan faction resisting civil rights at the time, of course, were the Southern Democrats. And so Buckley, as he launches this magazine, chooses a different course. And I argue in the book, I don't want to make these really big causal claims. William F. Buckley did X, therefore Y. But he makes a decision, and that decision has ramifications as part of a lot of other decisions down to where we stand today. And so I'll give you a sense of what that amounts to for Buckley and National Review on civil rights. So Buckley's founding the magazine, right? In 1954, we have Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, the white backlash against that decision, the white citizens councils, the Ku Klux Klan, and so on. We also have the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. We have the arrest of Rosa Parks in 1955. We have the Montgomery bus boycott, the rise of this young minister, Martin Luther King, in 1955. All that is happening right at the same time Buckley is launching the magazine. So what is National Review's position going to be? Their position is they are against Brown v. Board. They not only against Brown v. Board as an illegitimate act by the judiciary from their perspective, but they are against any federal intervention to combat Jim Crow, period. Any federal intervention, whether it's done by the courts or done by Congress. They make that entirely clear. They are critics of Martin Luther King and most forms of social protest, except the idea of an economic boycott. That's the one legitimate form of social protest from National Review's perspective. We can talk more in the Q&A about the nuances of that position. Their reaction to the Montgomery bus boycott in particular is really interesting. But that's important. They're critics of King at just about every turn, right? They're critics of the sit-in protesters. They're critics of the Freedom Riders. They're against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they are in a position, undoubtedly, of resistance to this civil rights revolution happening in the country. Now, how do they rationalize that? Well, this is a long story, and I'll make it relatively short, and I get into as much detail as I can in the book to try to give readers a sense of here's how they understood the world, and here's why they did what they did. I'm trying to give them the opportunity to speak for themselves. Buckley enlists people like Richard Weaver in the lower right of your screen, who was a professor of rhetoric at the University of Chicago and a very important thinker. Weaver argues essentially what he gives Buckley is a philosophical defense of everything his mother ever taught him about race. Weaver defends the Southern regime, as he calls it, as a regime that, yes, has this kind of racial hierarchy as a central feature of it, but it's a beneficent or a benevolent racial hierarchy. There is such a thing, Weaver argues, as fruitful inequality. There's this kind of noblesse, the system of noblesse oblige that's central to the system. So Buckley publishes things like that and champions those sorts of articles. He also is, publishing, nice, puff pieces on Senator Strom Thurmond, pictured in the bottom left of your screen. Thurmond was an old family friend. The Buckleys had an estate in South Carolina, in addition to that estate I described earlier. And he was somebody who the magazine called a latter-day Patrick Henry, who's leading an American revolution. You see Thurmond here pointing at the clock as a point of pride, as after he gave a 24-hour filibuster speech in resistance of civil rights. Buckley's go-to guy on race in the upper left there is James Jackson Kilpatrick, who was identified as the leading salesman for segregation, who devoted every moment of his professional life to defending white supremacy and segregation in through every means available to him. Buckley even cozied up behind the scenes to William J. Simmons in the upper right of your screen, who was a leader of the White Citizens Council movement. The White Citizens Council movement was, I think, aptly described by Bayard Rustin, a civil rights activist, and others as the uptown or Rotary Club version of the Ku Klux Klan. Same values as the Klan, different outfits and different means. They wouldn't burn crosses and wear the hoods, but they would ruin people's lives if they were perceived to be sufficiently or too friendly to civil rights. So Buckley's own position comes through loud and clear on these issues. So he's working with all these people in this kind of mode of resistance, but he also makes his own views very clear in a series of editorials. Most famously or infamously, in 1957, Buckley writes this piece called "Why the South Must Prevail." And that piece, the proximate cause for that piece was the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is a Civil Rights Act we don't tend to talk very much about anymore, because it was a piece of legislation that was hollowed out of just about any meaning by Southern Democrats through unfriendly amendments. So the central way they did this is through basically a jury nullification clause. And long story short, what they did is they built into the bill any accusation of a violation of the civil rights of an African American in the South would not be considered by a federal judge. It would be considered by a jury. And of course, that would be an all-white jury. And an all-white jury in the South wasn't going to convict anyone of violating anyone's rights when the rights in question were those of an African American. So this is a jury nullification clause. And Buckley writes this editorial, "Why the South Must Prevail," defending this jury nullification clause. And what he says in the piece, in short, is he says the white people are allowed to do what they think is necessary to prevail culturally and politically because they are, for the time being, the advanced race. That's a almost exact quote, and I have the exact quote at the beginning of my presentation if we want to look at it later. So Buckley takes this, explicitly white supremacist position, but again, it's this white supremacist position that is, he believes it's benevolent, right? He argues at the end of that piece, there's a kind of obligation that white people have in this position of superiority to work toward the equality of African Americans. So I say that if one of the slogans of the civil rights movement was freedom now, Buckley's slogan for the civil rights movement, I like to say, is some freedom one day when we decide you're ready. So Buckley gets a little bit of pushback from within the magazine for taking this, and he goes back and forth, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But while Buckley is trying to figure out just how far it's okay for resistance to civil rights to go, right in that same period, so 1957, James Baldwin is coming back to the United States. So, I mean, this for me as a writer was the moment, and I think for a lot of readers was a moment, that was significant, where I go from this really deep dive into what Buckley and his crew are doing in 1957 in reaction to the Civil Rights Revolution. Go from that, and within 2 weeks of the kind of back and forth that Buckley is having at the magazine about the Civil Rights Act of 1957, James Baldwin is back in the United States, and he's sitting in the living room of a 15-year-old kid who's the first African-American student at a previously all-white high school. and he's looking into this young man's eyes and trying to get a sense of what the world looks like through those eyes. And so Baldwin is there in this living room, and he wants to know from this young man, what was it like for him on his second day of school to be walking toward the school to see a group of his white classmates arm in arm forming a human barricade meant to keep him out of school? What was it like for this young man, Gus Roberts, to be subjected to, verbal and physical assaults on a daily basis? Baldwin asked this really haunting question. He says, I really wanted to know what it was like for Gus to face what was undoubtedly the most difficult moment of every day, the moment when he wakes up in the morning and opens his eyes and realizes it all has to be gone through again. So Baldwin this is Baldwin. That is quintessential Baldwin. Baldwin's trying to get us, to get his readers, and mostly white readers, I should say. He's down there reporting on civil rights for, liberal magazines in New York that are sort of have mostly white audiences. So he's trying to give folks a sense of what the world looks like through the eyes of somebody like Gus. He also talks to Gus's mother. He wants to know what it's like to be, Gus's mother is one of only a few dozen African-American parents in Charlotte, North Carolina, who even applied for this integration program. This is a city that had 50,000 African-American people at the time. And so Baldwin wants to know, what is it like for her to have the audacity to put it all on the line? And she knows, put her son's safety on the line, put her family's safety on the line, just so that he can get a better education. What is that like for her? And Baldwin, as the oldest of 9 children, always sort of thought of himself as this kind of quasi, parent to many of his siblings. And he was always haunted by that question of what the world looks like through the eyes of a parent at the margins of our society. There's a really powerful moment in 1943 that he describes in one of his essays in the mid-50s, where he describes being in a Harlem church at his father's funeral and looking around that church at all these parents and just sort of thinking about what he called the impossibility that confronted each of those parents. How do these parents grapple with the fact that they have to send their children out into a hostile world, and there's nothing that they can do to possibly protect their children in that world? Baldwin was always haunted by that question, and that's the kind of question that he's trying to get at with Gus's mother in Charlotte in 1957. Baldwin goes from there, from meeting with Gus and his mother, to meeting with a young white principal of Gus's school. And Baldwin says, I walk into this room, go over to the school, meet with this principal. And in many ways, I was, prepared for a fist fight. But he actually found himself rather liking the guy. He said he seemed like a gentle human being. He seemed like he was even honorable in some ways. But he was also delusional. Baldwin says that as I went back and forth with him, I realized pretty quickly that what was happening in front of his eyes, and he was, very much a participant in this as Gus enters his school, was against everything he'd ever been taught. His universe had been turned upside down. And so Baldwin is really trying this kind of radical empathy that Baldwin shows in these moments. He really wants to try to see the world through the eyes of this principal, right? What he says to him at one point, what is it like for you? He says, this must be very difficult for you to be caught up in this drama for which you are no more responsible than Gus is, right? So Baldwin is sort of really interested in that question. And he says in that moment when he asked the principal that question, his eyes kind of changed and his face opened in a way it hadn't opened before. And so Baldwin wants to try to get us to think about the world through the eyes of others. So that's the kind of work that he's doing in this period. I am going to get us to the debate so we can wrap up and chat. And so I just want to say very briefly, just to give some more ground for questions and things you might want to talk about in our conversation. In 1960, in the early 60s, so much is happening. Baldwin and Buckley are in the eye of the storm, right? They are not only living through this history, but they are helping shape this history. And so Baldwin and Buckley are also, for me as a writer, I had a glimpse into their minds almost every day as they're living through and shaping this history. So not only all the published writings, but Baldwin and Buckley are, their archives are vast. So Buckley's archive at Yale, all these letters he's writing, all these memos back and forth at National Review. You really get a chance of sort of watching his mind evolve through this period and try to respond to the latest moments in the civil rights revolution and the rise of Goldwater and so on, the rise of George Wallace, you can see pictured here. In Baldwin, the same is true. He's not quite as prolific as a letter writer as Buckley is, but there's so much that he kept. It's now at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem that helped me tell this story of them living through and shaping this history. So I'm just going to say two things that I will highlight that we can come back to in the Q&A if you'd like. Two moments for me that I like to highlight with audiences that I'll be happy to discuss. Or one is that Baldwin in 1962, he's really willing to engage in debate with just about anybody, including James Jackson Kilpatrick, the gentleman I mentioned a moment ago, who was Buckley's go-to guy on questions of race in the upper left-hand corner. Baldwin debates him on segregation in late 1962, and it's an extraordinarily powerful exchange, and I'd love to tell you more about it in the Q&A if you'd like. And so Baldwin's doing that work. He's sort of trying to strike the balance between his role he sees as a witness, as somebody who's writing all down, who's trying to do this kind of creative work to capture this historical moment, but also as an activist. He's somebody who's never fully comfortable with that label. He doesn't like being called a spokesperson. He doesn't like being called an activist. He doesn't like being thought of as a public figure or a leader in that way, because he doesn't see that as his proper role. But he is engaged, especially in 63. He is on the road as an activist in all sorts of ways. And so I'm happy to talk more about that if you like. And he knows, Medgar Evers pictured here, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Baldwin interacts with all these sort of major leaders in important ways. Buckley, on the other hand, is also engaged in this really important work, both as a writer and as a public figure. He's a champion of the Barry Goldwater campaign for president in 1964. Buckley is resisting, as I said earlier, all these sort of pieces of legislation and direct actions in the civil rights revolution. He's trying to figure out how the conservative movement ought to respond to people like George Wallace and these sort of arch segregationist political figures. And Buckley, the big theme here that I want to highlight is that Buckley is adapting, right? So he's trying to figure out, and he's very explicit about this. He's really trying to think through these questions, and he gives us, all the evidence we need to understand how he's thinking about this. He's trying to grapple with a couple questions. One, is it okay for the conservative movement to utilize the energy of white backlash in order to fuel the conservative ascendance? That's a question on Buckley's mind. Is it okay, even if I have moral qualms about it, to cozy up to people I find to be, morally offensive? Very much a relevant question for us today. Buckley grapples with that question, and he reaches certain conclusions that we should discuss. He's also grappling with the question of how can the conservative movement, if it's willing to tap into that white backlash, and spoiler alert, the answer is yes. Buckley says it is okay. He makes the strategic choice to cozy up with a lot of these people. Is it okay then, if we cozy up with these people, how can the sort of white backlash politics adapt to a situation in which we're losing many battles, right? So Buckley loses the battle in many ways he loses the battle of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to use just one example. And so in 64, he's trying to figure out, okay, what does the next phase in racial politics look like? And what he does is he starts to argue that the white backlash needs to be defended, but it needs to be defended in a new way. It needs to be more subtle, and it needs to take on issues that the broader public, beyond just the hardcore of American conservatism, the hardcore of the Southern resistance, we need to tap into issues that the broader public views as the civil rights revolution going too far. So for example, in 64, he's emphasizing things like busing to achieve greater racial balance in the schools in the North, right? He's emphasizing things like fair housing law, right? These are things that all of a sudden people, for example, in very liberal California, they are the same electorate that overwhelmingly votes for Lyndon Johnson over Barry Goldwater. The vote was even more overwhelming. That electorate, meaning many maybe most Goldwater voters, I think we can say, and many Johnson voters simultaneously pulled the lever for Johnson and voted to overturn fair housing law in California, right? So Buckley sees that is the future of conservative ascendancy. So that's just a couple of things to keep in mind. Now, I'm just going to play a couple short clips, and then we can chat. So just fast forward now from all of that to early 1965. So again, we're in the midst of the Selma campaign, And there is this backstory of how did Baldwin and Buckley end up there that night. And I'm happy to talk about that. One of the really cool things about this project was I got to interview many of the students who hosted them. 50 years later, many of those folks are still alive, and I got to chat with them, which was incredible. So I can tell you more about how they ended up there, but they're there that night to debate the motion, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. That was the motion Baldwin and Buckley are asked to debate. And so here's a little bit from James Baldwin's speech. So two students speak before them, and then Baldwin gets up to deliver his remarks.
Is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
All right, so we could listen to James Baldwin all night, but I'll stop it there. And I'll just there's definitely a lot to say about his speech. He gets up and really, as I said earlier, delivers this sermon. He announces, "I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah." So he's announcing very explicitly he's there to deliver a particular kind of sermon, a Jeremiah about white supremacy and the ways in which white supremacy destroys, he says, the lives not only of the subjugated, is the term he uses, but also the lives of the subjugators, right? The would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy are also its victims. So I think that's a really important theme in Baldwin's lecture, his speech that night. And I'm happy to tell you more about that in the Q&A. And I think it's really important to know he also wants to draw our attention to this idea of expense, right? The motion asked the debaters to consider the idea of expense. You see in the clip I just played the way Baldwin is thinking about the American dream, I think in extraordinarily powerful ways, by asking us to think intergenerationally about freedom and opportunity and dignity. But also he talks about expense. The next part of his speech is where he delivers probably the most famous section of the speech, is when Baldwin says, I'm speaking very literally, I picked the cotton. I built the railroad. I carried it to market for nothing. And so Baldwin really wants to draw our attention to this idea of legacy, right? Where the past meets the present, the way in which history is present in all that we do. So that is, that's a little bit about a very, very complicated and amazing speech. Now, Baldwin delivers that speech. It's about 24 minutes long. If you watch the BBC recording online, you actually see all of it. The BBC didn't really find any way to cut any of Baldwin's speech. Buckley's speech is actually a little longer. It turns out to be 29 minutes. The BBC recording is edited down. And so one thing I was able to get in the midst of the research for the book was the full Buckley speech. So I can tell you more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But Baldwin gives this speech. there's a standing ovation, which very rarely happened at the Cambridge Union. And so then Buckley, you know, he says, I sensed it wasn't going to be my night, he said later, but he gets up and here's a little bit of William F. Buckley.
It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals, that our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coding which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power.
All right, so so that's a little bit of William F. Buckley's speech there. I always love playing that clip because Baldwin's reaction shots are priceless. But there's, you know, so that's part, but it does also capture substantively one of the central themes for Buckley that night, which was to argue that Baldwin was this dangerous radical hell-bent on overthrowing Western civilization, and that he was there as this guardian of, as he calls it in the speech, the faith of our fathers. You know, substantively, the other major point that I think is important to draw to your attention in Buckley's speech is that he says toward the end of his speech that the quote-unquote Negro problem is the result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is that there are individual racists out there, and they need to be convinced to not be so racist, right? And he uses that term, individual racist. And he says they need to be convinced morally. It's not a matter of changing the law. It's a matter of convincing them morally that racism is not okay. Now, it's an interesting argument because on the one hand, the use of individual racists is kind of a few bad apples sort of an argument. It also excludes Buckley and everything he'd been doing from in the last 10, 15 years on race from the category of racism. So Buckley is using this definition of racism that really, for him, racism is something that is rooted in animus. And so he doesn't see anything that he's been doing as racist. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Now, this unfortunate conjunction has these individual racists over here, and then the other side, Buckley says, is the other, you know, sort of reason for the Negro problem, as he calls it, is failures of the Negro community. So we have individuals over here, and then failures of the Negro community over here, and he uses that exact phrase. That's not an accident. He's very deliberate in that choice, and this is not an argument that's anything that, you know, it'll be very familiar because we could turn on to the television right now and see similar arguments being made. Buckley argues that yes, there ought to be more opportunities made available to African Americans, but there also needs to be African Americans need to take greater advantage of the opportunities that are already there. And so he calls on Baldwin. He says, Baldwin, you know, Mr. Baldwin, as a responsible leader, what you should be doing is, rather than always being so cynical and complaining all the time, you ought to be encouraging, quote unquote, your people to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. So that's Buckley's argument. Now, Buckley loses. This debate is 544 to 164 is the final vote. But I argue in the book that Buckley, although he loses the battle, he wins the war in some ways. So I will conclude there and just there we go. I'll just conclude there. And there's a lot that happens after the debate that we can discuss as well, but I hear a lot of dinging, which means people have questions. So let's have some Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for a really, really wonderful talk. So we're now going to open the floor for
And I'll
questions.
stop share. Yeah, I'll stop share so I can see everybody.
Oh, okay. We're now going to open the floor for questions. I think the easiest way to do this would be, if you have a question, please go ahead and just put your name in the chat, and I can just call on the names in the order in which they're in the chat. If for some reason you're not able to use your microphone, you can just paste your question into the chat, and I will be happy to read it for you. So again, floor is open for any questions or considerations anybody would like to raise. Okay, Maya Pelletieri, and I'm going to apologize if I mangle anybody's names, so apologies in advance. Maya asks, how did the media portray and react to Baldwin's speech?
Yeah, good question, Maya. So, yeah, the media reacted, very quickly. And so the speech was actually a news story in the London papers, but also in the New York Times within within a couple of days. And then the New York Times actually published what they call the condensed transcript of the Buckley-Baldwin debate in the Sunday magazine on March 7th, 1965, which happened to be the same day as Bloody Sunday, the Selma March. So, so the media reacted. The BBC recording went out to the UK, and then soon it was picked up by public television in the US, and it sort of ran repeatedly in the US. So it was one of those debates that in the time a lot of people were seeing it and talking about it. And Buckley and Baldwin go on about 3 months later. They meet on American television on a show called Open End and have a second debate that we can talk about if you like. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, sort of the debate itself was much discussed, and then so much more is happening. 3 days after the debate, Malcolm X is assassinated. As I said, 2 weeks after the debate, you have the Bloody Sunday March. You have the Selma to Montgomery March after that. Buckley runs for mayor of New York City later in '65. So all sorts of other things occur that, that are sort of news stories about these two individuals. But yeah, the debate itself was widely covered.
We next have a question from Jeff Cook. Jeff, would you like to ask your question, or would you prefer me to do it? Okay, all right. So Professor Cook asks, is there any evidence that either Buckley or Baldwin was changed by the debate? Did it seem to have any effect on either one in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so the book itself, I have these 2 big chapters about the debate itself. As I said, 250 pages in the book, and then I have one more chapter after the debate, a substantive chapter to kind of reflect on the things that happened later in '65, but also the sort of evolving views of Baldwin and Buckley. Yeah, so I guess a couple of things to say on that front. I mean, one is that the two of them, as they reflect on it, so Buckley almost right away, takes to his typewriter to continue the debate. So within 2 weeks, he publishes one of his syndicated columns. He calls it "The Negro and the American Dream," and he gives his account of what happened that night. And one thing is, I say in the book that, for some people, defeat can be humbling. For William F. Buckley, it was infuriating. Buckley refuses to give anything in terms of his reaction to Baldwin. He argues that he did not lose the debate despite the vote. What happened was that Baldwin didn't make better arguments. It was that the students were simply trying to affirm Baldwin's identity, and they were not interested in really anything that he had to say or Baldwin had to say. And if they respected Baldwin more, they would have actually voted against him. Is Buckley's argument. And he goes on. I mean, he writes about the debate. I mean, for the next 50 years, he keeps writing about it. It's sort of 40 years. Buckley continually writes about this encounter with Baldwin, and he says in 1968, most notably, Gary Wills is interviewing Buckley, doing a profile of him for Esquire magazine, and he asked, he asked Buckley about the Baldwin debate. And Buckley says, I've never lost a debate, and I've debated a lot. I've never lost a debate by a greater margin, but there is, no debate that, for which I have more pride in my performance. And Buckley says, I didn't give them one goddamn inch. Is the sort of the reason for that pride. By the way, I said that on PBS and they bleeped me. And I was just quoting Buckley. I guess you can't say goddamn on PBS. But yeah, so that's important. So in a sense, Buckley didn't, learn. And one of the questions that sort of I thought about a lot, as I worked on the book is, what if Buckley had listened, right, to Baldwin's speech, and what if he had actually tried to respond to it? That would be fascinating. But the second meeting they have is the one that Baldwin really stung Baldwin or changed Baldwin a lot more than the first one. So Baldwin was, first of all, none of Baldwin's people, his agents and so on, wanted him to be there. They actually tried to cancel a debate with Buckley a week before it happened. And Baldwin, though, felt this obligation to engage with people like Buckley. And so when he's asked right after the debate, so a reporter runs up to him right after the debate and asks him, Mr. Baldwin, are you, what do we say? Did you enjoy the debate? And Baldwin says, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I'm glad I was here. And so there's a kind of way in which Baldwin felt this responsibility to do what he did there that night. And what Baldwin says in 68, also in 68, he's interviewed and asked about Buckley, these two encounters with Buckley. And it's right, this is in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King, which Baldwin underwent a significant change as a thinker as a result of that assassination of the sort of preacher of love. Baldwin says to the interviewer, I was trying to reason with Buckley. I was hoping he would listen. I was trying to do the Martin thing, is what Baldwin says. But he says, people like Buckley will never listen. He said, what I should have done is hit him over the head with my coffee cup. Now, Baldwin, when he said that, was making a joke, but it was this joke that has a serious point at its core. He says at Cambridge, the thing that concerns him most, he says, what concerns me most toward the end of his speech, is that reason, the authority of reason and discourse will break down to such an extent that, discourse will lose all of its authority, right? And so when you think about Baldwin saying that in 1965, and you think about where we are today, it's extraordinarily haunting. So those are a couple of responses from Baldwin and Buckley after the debate. Thanks for the questions. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. We have one from Amaya, and she asks, what was meant by Baldwin won the battle, but Buckley won the war?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Maya. That's kind of one of the big themes of the book is that, so when this night, right, and the moment is significant too. I mean, really, they meet at Cambridge at the high tide of the civil rights, that phase in the civil rights revolution. We're in the wake of the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Lyndon Johnson landslide, the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act of 1965 will be signed that summer. But so there's reasons why Baldwin should have been feeling triumphant in those days. But he knows, and this is something that's really fascinating and important about Baldwin, is that Baldwin is somebody who's never, whenever there's a sort of big moment politically, a victory, a big electoral victory, or a big legislative victory, or a big court victory, Baldwin is the kind of thinker, as this kind of prophetic, voice, who's always there to say yes, but, right? There's all sorts of things that he's happy, right, that you have a Civil Rights Act as opposed to not having it. But he knows, or his suspicion is that what ails us, what troubles us, goes much deeper, right? It goes to our souls, is the kind of language he would use. And so he knows that the country really has still not come to terms with its history, and that we as individuals and as a collective we're still in this state of identity crisis that I said he was obsessed with from his earliest days as a writer. And so Baldwin, so that is all a setup to say, is that Baldwin is not terribly surprised in what we see happen in the late 60s, right? With the sort of the rise of the re-rise, the coming back from the dead of Richard Nixon and the Law and Order and the Southern Strategy and eventually the rise of Reagan and so on. So I mean, Baldwin, by the end of his life, Baldwin dies in 1987. I mean, Baldwin really agrees with that conclusion, right? That he, his point of view has kind of lost the war for the American soul. There was many battles won over the years, but that basically the country itself was still failing to live up to its creed, was still failing to deliver on a promise of universal human dignity. And so that's the kind of sense that, whereas Buckley in 1987, by the time, when Baldwin dies, Buckley lives till 2008, and Buckley feels, triumphant, right? I mean, he's now invited into the White House, right, with Reagan and so on. So that's the kind of general point I'm making there about the sort of battle and the war. And obviously, the battle and war analogy has many limits, but that's at least what I meant.
All right. We have one now, a question from Bradley Tabor Thomas. Professor Tabor Thomas asks, what lessons do you see for today's discourse between social justice advocates and their critics?
Oh man, that's a big one. Yeah, so what lessons? I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that one thing I found really fascinating about Baldwin and Buckley, I think that they had a few things in common, right? And that one is that obviously this devotion to language, right? Each is this extraordinarily gifted in their use of language and uses this power to try to change the world, or one way or another. But I think that the other thing that's fascinating is, of course, they both love to argue. They're sort of Buckley is he ends up the year after the debate with Baldwin, he has Firing Line, his television show for over 3 decades, where he's sitting there arguing with people. And so, but one of the things I think was really fascinating to look at was, what does it mean to argue in a meaningful way with people who disagree with you, right? And I think that Baldwin provides a really interesting model that in some ways might be out of step with some contemporary trends. Baldwin he would often say, I would rather have an argument with a Southern racist. He said this actually to Norman Mailer, of all people. He said, I'd rather have an argument with a Southern racist than you, Norman, because I feel like the Southern racist would be more honest with me. So there's a kind of Baldwin has a lot of negative things to say about conservatives, but he has even more nasty things to say about liberals. And Mailer wasn't a liberal, but a radical like Mailer, who he thought was kind of missing the point. But yeah, so Baldwin, so what is that? So that's interesting, right? In this context, think about Baldwin writes The Fire Next Time, this extraordinary literary sensation it's published first as a long essay, the major part of it, in the New Yorker in late 1962. It comes out, and Norman Podhoretz, who was the editor of Commentary Magazine, who's still alive, I interviewed him for the book, knew Baldwin and Buckley. He's one of these rare figures who was friends with both in different parts of his life. Podhoretz writes this piece called My Negro Problem and Ours, and it's this extraordinary piece. I mean, it's the kind of thing today. Talk about cancel. I mean, Norman Podhoretz would have been canceled. I mean, he was canceled in 1963 when it was published. But Baldwin steps up and says, Podhoretz says some very controversial things about race in that piece. But Baldwin, so he's getting condemned by a lot of people on the left. Baldwin says he thinks it's an extraordinary achievement. Why? Because Podhoretz is being honest. And he says Podhoretz is saying things people don't want to hear. And Baldwin would say a lot of things that I think are wrong, but he's being more honest with me than somebody like, let's just use an example of one of the liberals that Baldwin was often picking on, Robert Kennedy. He's like, I often felt like Robert Kennedy in those days. I think Kennedy, got better later, but in those days, he thought Robert Kennedy was not being entirely honest with him about race. So I say all that to say that, I mean, Baldwin would call on all of us in the sort of discourse between, sort of folks in identifying with social justice movements and folks who are more conservative or whatever, however we want to label them. I think that what Baldwin calls on us to be honest with each other. And what he wants is he wants serious people. I mean, the other thing he says about Buckley is not a serious man. When he says the coffee cup argument, he says that Buckley's not serious. And, you know, we can argue about that, but for Baldwin, he really wanted people who were going to be honest with him and who were serious and that were not there to perform. And so that's what I think we need more of that, right? We need seriousness. We don't have much seriousness in our political culture. I mean, we do, but it's not what rises to the top, right? And so we got we've got very serious problems, and so we need serious people, right? And I think that's what Baldwin calls on us to do. And I think, you know, Buckley, of course, would chafe at some of what I've said here. And Buckley had moments of seriousness in his political career. I don't think the best of William F. Buckley rose when it came to questions of race. So that's at least my argument in the book. Oh, Carly, you're muted again.
I'm really terrible at Zoom. I got to get better at this.
I've got my unmute yourself post-it right in front of my face. But.
I was just saying that I think we have time for one more question, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Hannah DiLiberto asks about Buckley. What was the role that Buckley played as an advocate for conservatism during the Reagan years? And did he have any influence over how Reagan acted during his presidency?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I will do something that is extraordinarily generous to me, which I'll do a shout out for a book of of somebody who doesn't really like my book that much. There's a guy, Al Felsenberg, who is a very, very great scholar. And actually, Al was very generous in our, the back and forth as I was working on this book. But Al has written a really good book. And he has some nice things to say about my book, but he and I just disagree about Buckley in some ways. But Al has a book called A Man and His Presidents, which is essentially a kind of political biography of Buckley by way of various presidents that, were around during his lifetime. And so some of those presidents he knew, some of them that he just had lots of thoughts about. And so Al does a really good job of digging into the relationship between Buckley and Reagan. And yeah, Buckley, he undergoes this really interesting process, that I think is probably something that a lot of public intellectuals go through at some point in their lives when they achieve a certain level of prominence. He becomes this really important figure, as I said in my talk, on the American conservative scene, but he doesn't, he's not quite in an official position, right? So he's kind of there. He's not quite a policy advisor, but you have people like Goldwater and Reagan who are reading National Review, right? So there's all these, photographs you can find of Reagan, lounging on the airplane, reading, on Air Force One, reading National Review. So, I mean, he's clearly playing this kind of role of providing, right, through the magazine and through, his television show, providing conservatives with arguments, with serious arguments. He wants to provide intellectually serious arguments. And so I think Reagan taps into that, from, in those early years when Reagan is going from being a New Deal Democrat to becoming a conservative Republican. Somebody like Buckley is playing a role in sort of educating him along the way as he's on the road, for General Electric, doing all these things he's doing before he becomes a politician. So that's really important. And Buckley stays on, as a kind of informal advisor to Reagan. They have a pretty robust relationship through letters. They see each other on occasion, so you can pull up on your Google images of them together, laughing in the White House or whatever. But Buckley's also writing letters to him back and forth and communicating with him and trying to provide, input. And they sometimes disagreed on things, and those are all obviously really interesting moments. But yeah, Buckley kind of had, I think that was sort of a redemptive moment for Buckley, the Reagan years, because in the 60s, when he is a champion of the Goldwater campaign, and really plays this crucial role in elevating, Goldwater with segments of the population. He sort of hoped that the Goldwater campaign would sort of reward him for those efforts with some sort of a role. He sort of envisioned a role for himself as a liaison between the conservative intellectual community and the campaign. And not only did they not give him that role, but they sort of people within the campaign kind of embarrassed him. They leaked a story to the New York Times basically saying, we're not going to associate with William F. Buckley because he's too far right. So that was really, so Buckley kind of, I think, had he certainly didn't have any illusions about sort of real politics when it came down to it. But I think later in his life, he has this weird relationship with Nixon that does end up, positive in some ways from his perspective. But he does, I think, have his strongest relationship with a president during the presidency of Reagan, for sure.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick. Excuse me, Dr. Buccola.
Nick is fine.
Please accept my thanks in lieu of what, if we were in a room, I'm sure would be thunderous applause for a really wonderful talk. I'm seeing some videos and little yellow hands, and so that should be an indication of how grateful we are for a really great discussion. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come and listen and to ask questions. We very much appreciate having you here. And we hope that you will look out for more announcements about events from the Forum on Constitutionalism and Democracy, and that you'll continue thinking about these and other really important big questions of our social and political life. So thanks so much, everyone, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
As people depart, Nick, I wonder if you wouldn't mind me asking you a question too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It can be off the record,
Okay.
so to speak. So just your previous work.
You want me to stop the recording, Carly?
Oh, you.
I'm just kidding.
Oh. You did all your previous work on Douglas.
Yeah.
The way that you were speaking about Baldwin in the debate with Buckley is, presenting this view of America as not living up to its creed, not living up to its ideals. And that sounds like a position that Frederick Douglass would have, could have taken also, right? That he, in any case, that there are these principles which are fundamentally good ones, but that America is failing in profound and serious and terrible ways to live up to them. Would you say that Baldwin and Douglas agree more than they disagree about these kinds of things, or is Baldwin's position, does it depart in significant ways from Frederick Douglass's view, sort of the United States at its sort of core principles and things like that?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's definitely there are definitely important differences. I mean, I think Baldwin is really tricky in this regard. And one of the things that I was interested in really investigating was if, taking Buckley's argument seriously. Like, Buckley is saying Baldwin is this dangerous radical. I mean, part of his speech that's cut out of the recording is he says, Baldwin is, basically wants you to raid the libraries around here and burn all the Plato and Aristotle and tear up all the Bibles and rip up the Constitution and so on and so forth. And as you could see from Baldwin's, face, right, when he that reaction shot when he is a little bit puzzled by Buckley's characterizations of him. I mean, Baldwin was a radical in a particular way, but he wasn't quite, especially in those years, was not the sort of radical Buckley was painting him to be. And this is where I think that Baldwin, as this kind of on this question of how does Baldwin position himself, in terms of kind of thinking about, sort of founding principles, or how does he position himself in terms of thinking about Western civilization? And I think that the answer, at least what I argue in the book, is that Baldwin, he has this really nuanced view, but it's a view that's really, I think, a kind of critical devotion to those things, right? So he wants us to be honest about the history, right? But he's so deeply, engaged with the Western tradition. Like I asked Norman Podhoretz what he thought of that, argument, and I loved his response. He said something like, he said, Jimmy didn't want to overthrow Western civilization. Henry James is part of Western civilization, but Baldwin has this wonderful piece. I mean, two pieces I recommend to people interested in the kind of general Western civilization question. One is 1953. Baldwin writes this piece called "Stranger in the Village," where he describes the experience of being in this little Swiss village where he says, I don't think they'd ever seen a black person before. So he was kind of a stranger in this little village, but he also uses that as a metaphor for being a stranger in Western civilization. And there's things in there that are really fascinating where he's kind of grappling with this question. Like he kind of says, I am suspect, right, within this tradition. But then there's another piece he writes, a decade later, 1964, called Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, in which you kind of get him rethinking a lot of where he sees his role, like as sort of part of the Western tradition, and how he's come to love Shakespeare. Like, he sort of thought, he said, I thought of Shakespeare as an architect of my oppression. And then I really got to know him and realized, like, there's actually so much here that I think, Shakespeare is doing. I'm trying to do something like what Shakespeare is trying to do. And I think the same is true with the founding and the American history. Baldwin is really interested in trying to grapple with, these kind of dialogues we're having about the 1619, 1776, 1787, like, Baldwin wants to grapple with all of it, right? And he says we can't choose one over the other, and one isn't more important than the other. They're all us, right? They're all part of us. So I think he, with Douglas himself, Baldwin had, he wrote this piece called "Smaller Than Life," in which he critiqued a biographer of Douglas for basically failing to really grapple with Douglas as a human being, right? And Baldwin himself, he never did this. It would have been really interesting if he ever pulled this off. But he expressed an interest in writing a biography of Booker T. Washington. Baldwin writing a biography of Booker T. Washington. So this is somebody who's largely, like, in that era dismissed as somebody who was a sellout. And Baldwin said, he didn't give us much about what he would have done, but he says, I think he's a much misunderstood figure, and there's probably a lot that we could learn, from, kind of studying him in a serious way. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to a really good question, but yeah, then I give you some reading assignments.
Yeah, I like them. Thank you. I do like reading, so I'm happy to take those on. Thanks so much again. This was really great.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw a lot of people expressing their enjoyment of the talk as well in the chat. So yeah, it was wonderful.
Great turnout. Thanks for hosting me. And definitely down the road, if I can follow up with any small group of students or whatever, just let me know.
Oh, that'd be great. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Unless there's anything that anybody wanted to say or needed from me, I'm going to end the Zoom chat and give Dr. Buccola a well-earned rest.
All right. Thank you so much, Carly. Thanks, Aaron.
Bye. Good night, everyone.
Bye.